am Sean Doolittle. I grew up actually south of Lincoln, about 12, 15 miles south of Lincoln in the rural area there, sort of around the towns of Roca and Hickman, Firth, Cortland. I went to school at Norris, K through 12. Norris is the school that was famously flattened by the Hallam tornado a couple of years ago, and they've done a spectacular job of rebuilding. And my folks still live there in the house where I grew up. I went to college here in town, in the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. I did undergraduate and graduate work there in English. And I currently live in Omaha with my wife and our 2 kids. We've lived there since '97, so about 10 years, a little over 10 years now. And so that's who I am. You know, I started school. By the end of my high school days, I had come to the conclusion that I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know how you go about being a writer. And so as I was entering college, I was trying to think of ways to be a writer, and I thought being a journalist seemed like an obvious choice, a way to get a paycheck for writing. And I'd kind of always been most interested in fiction, but I thought, I needed to make a living while I was writing my stories, so I thought I would start in journalism. So I began my college studies at UNL in the journalism college as a journalism major, and I think that I started I think it was my first or my second semester. It was in the first year that I was in college that I took my first real journalism class and my first real fiction writing workshop at the same time. And with the comparison and the contrast of those 2 classes together, I realized that what I really wanted to do was write fiction. I didn't want to write facts. I wanted to make things up. And so I switched my major to English, and I continued on, got an undergraduate degree in English, and went on to study at the grad school. I studied particularly under fiction writers there, Gerald Shapiro, and Judy Slater. They were both great mentors and real inspirations to me as a young writer, and helped me out a lot in those days. Well, that's a tough question for me to answer, and it's a question that I almost think is better answered by readers in terms of what the influence of my time in the plains is on my writing. But I can say that when I started writing fiction, particularly novels, I guess as a younger writer, I had the idea that I should set them somewhere else, that Nebraska wasn't interesting enough in some way for the kind of crime fiction that I was writing. And so I wrote my first 2 novels are set in Los Angeles, where I have traveled and where I've been, and I know Los Angeles as a tourist, but I've never lived there. And somewhere along the line, my wife and I, we weren't newlyweds per se, I don't think, but it was in the early, we certainly were still childless. We were in the earlier days of our marriage. We took a trip together to Cherry County, Niobrara River trip in the Sandhills, and we canoed the river and camped and just sort of poked around that area. And that trip was very I think almost in a way formative for me as a writer. I really just fell in love with that area. It's the first time I'd spent any real time out there. And I knew it was just such an evocative place in terms of a setting that I really knew that I wanted to do something set there, write a story that was set there. And when I finished my second novel, I was really Burn. I was really looking to change things up and do something different, and it felt like the time to try to write that Sandhill story. And so I wrote Rain Dogs, which is set in Cherry County, Nebraska. It's maybe the first piece of fiction, but certainly the first substantial piece of fiction that I wrote set in the state where I grew up. And the book, as all my books have been, it was a learning experience. I don't know that I would call it my very best work or my best novel. I certainly hope that I'm not doing my best work now, but it was it was the book that I sort of felt myself come into my own voice a little bit more than I had. I felt like it was a centering kind of experience for me creatively, and I felt like after I had written that book, in the process of writing that book, and after writing that book and deciding what I wanted to do next, that process of coming home as a writer, I guess, really seemed to make some things gel in my creative life that I'd been working that had been working without my knowledge, I think, but kind of came together when I started setting my stories in Nebraska. And so I don't know how the Plains influences my writing specifically, but I do know that I have found a real creative home here that I've enjoyed over the past couple of books and hope to continue exploring over the next work. Well, I'll go back to teachers again. Jerry and Judy, Jerry Shapiro and Judy Slater, of course, at the university. Prior to meeting them at the university, I would point to a couple of teachers in my grade school and high school days who I think had a fairly strong influence. The first, I would say, Mrs. Russell, my fifth grade teacher, Ruby Russell, who I still feel to this day strange calling her by her first name. But Mrs. Russell would read to us when we came in from recess, and I don't know that necessarily stimulated my desire to write, but it was just a wonderful immersion in story, and I think it helped to deepen my life as a reader and as a consumer of stories. One book in particular that she read to us was Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls, and I went in to read that book myself a number of times as a 10, 11, 12-year-old. And so I really think of her as being a formative influence in my love of story and story listening, if not storytelling. Then later in high school, another English teacher by the name of Ed Baker, who passed away a few years ago. He's no longer with us, but he was a strong influence on me just in my regular classroom studies, but also as a older consumer of stories and a very young writer. Like Mrs. Russell, Mr. Baker would also read us stories in class. Sometimes he would take a Friday off and read us stories, and he was also on his own time a writer himself, and I found that to be very impressive. And the combination of his reading us fiction and my knowledge of his personal writing of fiction kind of sparked in me an interest in trying that for myself. And so that was the time, I think, junior, senior in high school, I really started to become interested in writing at a more adult level, I guess. I had always, I'd written as a kid for classroom assignments and things like that. And I think that I maybe showed a propensity for it or a knack for it, but I didn't have the drive or necessarily the interest in, trying to write a novel as a fifth grader or something like that. But between the two of them, Mrs. Russell and Mr. Baker, I think created a monster or something. That's an interesting question because I think it's hard, particularly when you first begin writing, and especially before you start to publish. I think a lot of aspiring writers will say this. It's kind of hard to give yourself permission to think of yourself as a writer. It's you are writing. You're a writer, but it doesn't feel somehow real, or it's hard to convince yourself that you're really a writer. But I knew pretty convincingly, I think, by the time I graduated high school, that I really wanted to be a writer, and I was working hard to learn the ropes and tell my little stories and things like that, and mimicking the writers that I enjoyed reading and things like that. And I guess I just at some point I just decided that I was going to be a writer, and that was the end of that story. I don't know when I really for sure knew that I was a writer, but I think once I decided to start writing stories, that was kind of the end of it for me. I became enthralled with the whole creative process pretty early that way. I guess I've heard writers say that they've always needed to write, or that writing for them is like drawing oxygen. It's just something they need to do. I don't know that I need to write. I can do other things and not write, and I can imagine a life not writing, but I don't think that I would be as happy. I feel better when I'm writing. I feel more fulfilled as a person and a member of the human race, and I just, writing seems right to me. Pun, language pun not intended, but as a writer, I tend to. I think it's best, if I were going to give advice to a younger writer, I would say write every day, write all the time, don't stop writing, even if you don't know what you're doing necessarily, even if you don't have something particular in mind, just write a little bit every day. Just keep in practice, keep those muscles strong. I think that's the best advice for a writer. It's not advice that I tend to follow. I write something, and then I seem to kind of empty myself into whatever I'm doing, and then I'm kind of tired for a period of time, and I don't write for a period of time. Particularly with novels, I tend to really empty the tank when I'm writing a novel, and when I'm finished, I'll go for a period of time without writing much of anything. In fact, right now I'm in a period where I haven't written much of anything in a period of time, and I can feel myself sort of yearning to get back to it. I mean, it seems like I just kind of naturally turn on again and feel the need to get back to it. I don't know if it's a creative clock or whatever that runs out or starts ticking or however you want to phrase it, but it just seems like something that I feel compelled to do it in a way that I don't necessarily know that I can explain, but the cycle seems to continue, so as long as it continues, I'll hopefully keep following it. Sometimes I think I think there are writers who write for themselves and who really they're not driven by the need to share their work with others. Writing is a very personal and sort of intimate act for them. But I always have, and I don't know if it's ego or narcissism or what it is exactly, but I always have wanted to share my writing. I write things for the purpose of people eventually reading them. Whenever I finish something, my first urge, after patting myself on the back or not, depending on what I think about the work, my first urge is to share it, to get it out there to readers, to have other people consume it the way I consumed those early stories that were read to me by teachers. And in a way, the work almost doesn't feel quite finished yet until it's been read, by a reader. So, I don't know. I guess any number of different things can inspire me to write. It could be, an idea that just seems very interesting, or something that I don't always set out to put myself into my stories, but oftentimes what ends up in my stories are issues that are current in my own life, things that affect me, things that I'm thinking about, the stage of life that I'm in, finds its way into the work. And so I think just the urge to tell stories is the primary inspiration, and everything else kind of just filters in. Of course, as a writer, other writers inspire me when I read somebody that I love, or hear a story, or even see a movie, or just talk to somebody on the street. That joy of storytelling and hearing stories and telling stories, I think, is ultimately the inspiration. But it's hard to put a finger on, I think. I expect that that's true, and I think that that's another one of those topics that seems almost better left to the reader and not the writer. At a certain point, I realized after writing 2 or 3 books, I looked back at the work and realized that there were certain common threads. The main characters all were of a certain type. They were all in a certain stage of their life. They were all transitional kind of characters. They were moving from one place in life to another. Oftentimes they were a little bit rootless and a little bit unanchored or uncentered, and I suspect that maybe that's a reflection of my own progression in my own life as I sort of found my way to the work that I'm doing now. But I'll say this: I don't set out to write specific themes, and I don't consciously return to certain themes. But I think, certain themes naturally come up. I think family relations tend to play a pretty strong role in most of my work, and that comes from not, I've been blessed with a good, strong family life and good family ties, and I haven't lacked for familial relations. And so I'm not writing out of any kind of, I guess, hole in my own experience, but I do find family relations to be compelling, and I think that all of us are so formed by our, parentage and our, friends and family and lack thereof or abundance thereof, that it's hard for me to imagine a character without imagining the character's, family experience. So oftentimes a character will really start to take on a life for me when I start to think about that character's brothers and sisters and mother and father and things like that. Well, I still have a regular day job, and a family, wife and 2 small kids. My daughter just turned 7, and my son just turned 3 this spring. So I do have other things going on, and writing is oftentimes a matter of trying to fit the writing time into the schedule. I have tended to work best very late at night. I don't know why. I suspect it's because I always had early bedtimes as a kid that I now feel the need to stay up late. I don't know if that's true, but I'm a real night owl, and I can't seem to unwind or make myself want to go sleep at the end of the day. What I want to do is wait for everyone else to go to bed and then go off into my own little corner and do my thing. And so I've typically written very late at night after the rest of the household is sleeping. But I'm also getting a little older, and my brain isn't quite as resilient as it used to be. And by the end of the day, oftentimes now I'm kind of spent and not at my best. So I'm trying to find other times that work. Early in the morning seems to work pretty well, but my natural rhythms don't seem to lend themselves to early morning activities. So I'm working on it. I hate to keep copping out and saying the reader should determine these things, but yeah, again, I would like to think that I do have a voice and a style that's distinctive to me, but I don't know that I can explain what that is necessarily. I think it's what all writers need to find. We all need to find our voice, and what exactly voice is kind of a mysterious question. I mean, I think style and voice are perhaps interchangeable and maybe not. I think it kind of maybe boils down to just an overall worldview, how we look at things, what I respond to as a person, and what versus what you respond to as a person when we both look at the same thing, and the way I respond is what goes into my fiction. All I can really say is that I don't set out to try to convey a certain kind of voice or a certain kind of style. In fact, what I try to do when I write is stay as invisible as possible. I would like for the story to be all that the reader is engaging. When they're reading one of my stories, I want the reader to be completely immersed in the story, and I don't want to butt in. I don't want them to look at me. I want them to be involved in what's happening on the page, and sometimes I'm more successful at that than others, probably, but whatever's unique to me in my voice hopefully occurs organically, in the process of writing, and as a presence in the story, the author, me, is somewhere off in the wings, out of the picture. I don't think that I do. I read this question previously, and I was trying to decide whether I wrote for anyone or not, and I think that I don't write with anybody in particular in mind. I do think that I write with the characters in mind. I try to write, if I'm writing a scene, with the characters in a story, I'm trying to write that scene as honestly as I can in terms of what I think the characters are like and the way I think they think and what I think is happening. I try to make everything as true and honest in that way as I can. And so in a way, I'm almost writing for the characters in the story. Second to the characters, I suppose I'm writing for myself in that I would like to generally write the sort of thing that I would want to read. So I guess on some lower level, I have myself in mind as a reader in terms of just writing something that I find interesting. But I don't write for a specific audience, and in fact, I think that I would recommend not writing for a specific audience if I had to give a piece of advice to a younger writer, just because I think you can maybe restrict yourself in a certain way if you're writing with somebody in mind. Or there's a novelist named Vicki Hendricks who once said, I heard her say that you should write as though your parents are dead. In what she meant by that is, not to imagine that your parents are dead, but that you should not worry about what your mom might think. When you're writing a scene, the scene should be about what the scene is about, and not what the reader is going to think or how somebody else is going to respond. And I try to adhere to that as much as I can. Sometimes I think of my mother when I'm writing something, but usually I try to pretend that the only thing in the world is the person in the scene. And typically, I may have certain themes or points that I'm trying to make, certain things that I'm in the back of my mind. I think the story is about this, but I try not to be too conscious about conveying that. I hope that stuff comes out of the story organically, and I'm kind of very conscious about staying off a soapbox and not preaching to the reader about something that I think is important. I tend to think, as a reader and as a writer, that stories are more interesting when they ask questions and less interesting when they try to answer them. So I guess I feel like my job as a writer is to be interesting and to ask interesting questions, but not to try to tell anyone, how to think or what the right answer to a question is. And so I try to, it's part of I guess that goes back to the style and voice question. I try to stay out of it as much as possible. Well, this is completely unoriginal advice. I think almost any writer would give this piece of advice, but probably the best piece of advice is to read. Read as much as you can. Read as many different kinds of things as you can. Just be a voracious reader, because I think that's any writer's real nourishment. And outside of that, that's my creative advice. I think if you're interested in publishing, or if you want to be a published writer, then the advice is just sort of be diligent. Just don't give up. If you really feel like writing and publishing is something that you want to do, then your job is to read as much as you can, write every chance that you can, try to read as a writer as much as you can, learn from what you're reading, take what you learn and apply it to your own work. Strive to grow as a person and as a writer, and just keep doing all of that. Just keep doing all of that, and the publication will hopefully sort itself out. Well, it's about time to start another novel. I've been off for a little while, and I've been editing the current novel, which is due to be published in the winter. And so I'm currently sort of working on developing the next book. That's next up. And, I'm always interested in, I like to write short stories. I don't always have the opportunity to write them that I used to, but I like to write short stories when the opportunity presents itself. I would like to continue doing that. I love movies. I would love to try my hand at screenplays at some point in time. But mostly my aspiration is just to get better, to keep growing as a writer, and keep learning how to tell stories and how to go deeper and get into other areas of life that I'm learning now, and as I continue to get older and learn things as a person, I hope I continue to learn things as a writer and just keep getting better, keep getting better at it.
Good evening. Thanks for coming this evening. My name is Meredith McGowan, and I am the curator of the Heritage Room. I'd like to welcome you to the Heritage Room and to the John H. Ames reading series. We're excited that the reading has been around for more than 20 years. And in fact, tonight's reading is the 176th reading in this series. And you're here to enjoy it, so that's great. We are here in the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors. This is a representative special collection dedicated to promoting and preserving works by and about Nebraska authors. And right now there are about 13,000 volumes here, about 3,000 authors. And of course, if you look around the room, you'll see artwork and sculptures and other author memorabilia too. So we would also welcome you back into the room when we're open, Tuesday through Friday, 12 to 3, Sunday afternoons from 2 to 5. So we'd be glad to see you anytime then too. We'd also like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association. We're able to bring special programs like these because of an endowment established through their volunteer efforts over the years. Tonight our reader is Sean Doolittle. He has always lived in Nebraska, from Roca, well, around Roca, and in Lincoln, and he now lives in Omaha. It's often interesting to find out just what jobs writers have done during their lives. And I quote this from a piece of information that he gave me earlier, so I don't know if this is true or not. He's been a farmhand, a shipping dock hand. I don't know, he likes to put the hand in there, I guess. I don't know. He's been a grocery stock hand.
Did you say hand all the time?
You did. A fry cook, a kitchen manager. He kind of moved up there, I guess. A magazine writer. Now he's moving a little more into the writing. A magazine writer, a technical writer, and a fiction writer. So you can kind of see a progression there, right? And he's using his hand to, anyway. And he made the whole thing up. You'll have to ask him later what he really does. Anyway, he does have 2 degrees from UNL, and he has won some interesting awards over the years, and several caught my eye. One, the Mari Sandoz Prize for Graduate Fiction, and that was in 1994. And Crime Spree magazine's Favorite Book of the Year award in 2006. And 2007 had quite a few things that happened, I would say. Spine Tingler magazine, Best Paperback Original Award. The Berry Award, Best Paperback Original. And an honor book for the Nebraska Book Award. And also, Sean is this year's Nebraska Literary Heritage Association honorary author member. So we've been excited to have him with us during this year. Some people do long titles, I know, but I think Sean is kind of the master of the short title. If you know his books, Dirt, Burn, and then apparently he started doing the two-word title. I was going to show you this. Here's Burned. Here's Dirt. But then he did 2 words. Although he could have put this into 1 word, Rain Dogs. But it is 2. And The Cleanup. So now we have 2 words again. But I think we're back to 1. He's got a manuscript and a book that'll be published shortly called Safer. So he's back to the 1 word. You know, if you can say it in 1 word, why not? Anyway, we're happy to have Sean with us today. And if you could help me welcome him, I'd appreciate it.
Just for you, I'll write a sequel to Safer, and I'll call it Even Safer. Hi, folks. Thanks for. It's kind of a cruddy night, cold and rainy Nebraska spring evening, and I appreciate you all braving the elements and coming out to listen to me talk. I've been asked to read for 45 minutes to an hour, so you can all set your clocks to about 7:25, and if you'd like to just, you can do whatever you want during that time. You can listen, you can take a nap, you can spend that time as you wish. Meredith gave me a pretty good introduction, so I won't belabor who I am. I have lived in Nebraska all my life. I do live in Omaha now, and I'm happy to be here tonight. I thought that I would read a couple of things. I'm going to read first a short story that I completed a few weeks ago. I was asked to write this short story for an upcoming anthology that's being edited by another writer with Nebraska ties named John McNally. John, in addition to doing some of his college work and graduate work, I think, here in town, has also written some excellent novels and short stories, and he's edited quite a number of anthologies, and he's doing another one now. And another writer named Owen King, and they are editing an anthology of all new superhero short stories called Who Can Save Us Now? This is a book that will be out from Simon & Schuster in July. And according to, I'm not sure which editor said this, one of them calls it an anthology of unprecedented peculiarity containing irresistible, possibly dangerous levels of spandex and heroism. I was asked to write a superhero short story, and I almost couldn't do it. For the first time ever, I committed to a writing project that I found myself unable to follow through on. I just could not seem to get my superhero short story off the ground. And John, being a writer first and an editor second, being a writer first makes John an excellent editor because he knows what the writing process is like, and he's very deft at sort of encouraging you without pressuring you, but still coaxing you along in a very kind of productive way. And so thanks to John's tireless efforts as an editor of this anthology, I finally completed this short story, which is called Mr. Big Deal. And I was told that this would be taped and broadcast on the local access, so earlier today, I went through this manuscript and I edited out all the more egregious examples of profanity to make a broadcast-friendly reading. So as you're listening, you can just insert your own profanities where you think they ought to go. So here we go. Mr. Big Deal. Mid-shift, we take a call down near the freight yards. A disturbance at a bar named the Tip Top Lounge. I know the place, a dank little hole on the riverfront where the short haulers go to get drunk, blow off steam, and occasionally maim one another. My trainee is confused. She doesn't want to ask a dumb question, so she checks her bearings on the grid before she says, "Wouldn't that be the Southeast party?" "It would," I tell her, "but we'll go play backup on this one." "Oh." She nods along, eager to prove herself, if obviously still wondering why we're responding to a bar fight somewhere in another district when we're assigned to a relatively quiet bunch of streets in the northwest suburbs. They won't get bent out of shape when the north rolls up in their yard? I'm guessing no, I tell her. Oh, she says. I could tell her that bartenders at places like the Tip Top don't normally call the police for help when a customer goes on a tear. But we'll have a better picture soon enough. Meanwhile, it dawns on her that dispatch advised code 0 over the radio. She glances over and says, "Oh." Vasquez is her name. In the short time we've been riding together, this is the first she's hinted that she's heard any of the stories that I imagine she's heard about me. Don't worry. I pull a U-turn and punch the unit toward the Southeast Expressway. It'll probably be over by the time we get there. Hey, let's hope not. She smiles and hits the roof lights. We could use a little action. Off we go. According to dispatch, we're looking for a white male, presumed gifted, abilities unknown. He turns out to be easy enough to find. The Tip Top is barely standing when we arrive. It looks like somebody typed in the wrong coordinates and accidentally dropped artillery on the place. The roof is in tatters, the power is out, and the front entrance looks like an exit wound. Dead neon tubing bristles from the wreckage. Outside, the cracked, buckled plot of asphalt where the Tip Top sits is scattered with broken glass, fluttering scraps of trash, and random debris. There's a car burning near the curb. Some of the patrons are standing around in huddles, shouting and pointing in the firelight. A few others appear to be unconscious, piled on the ground here or there as though flung from a distance. Vasquez says, "Holy crap." She's leaning forward, eyes wide, looking up and out through the top edge of the windshield. I follow her gaze to a squad unit, presumably a Southeast District car, lying wheels up on the roof of a warehouse building across the street. The unit's top is crunched, windows gone. Steam billows from the exposed undercarriage. "Call Central," I tell her. "Tell them we're on site and code 12. When she doesn't respond, I look at her and say, "Tina." Vasquez blinks. In a moment, she pulls herself together and goes for the radio. I unfasten my seatbelt, open my door, and step out. The first thing I notice about the scene, apart from the sound of wood splintering somewhere inside the bar, is that there isn't another uniform on the ground within 200 yards of the place. Other units from the southeast are setting up a cordon at the other end of the block. I can hear more sirens approaching from somewhere in the distance. A department chopper circles above, rotor blades thumping the air, pinning the tip-top in a column of light. I start across the street. "Well, hey," a guy says to me. He's leaning against a darkened street lamp, well clear of the property, watching the chaos. "Thanks for stopping by." I look him over as I approach. Broad shoulders, bald head, muscles, chin beard. Bare arms and leather wristbands. Jailhouse tattoos. I note the bar rag on his belt and ask, "You're the party who made the call?" "A lot of good it did, huh? Hey, tell me something. You guys gonna drop this mutant or just watch from over there?" I glance over my shoulder at the perfectly good radio unit that somehow ended up on top of a warehouse 600 feet away and ask the bartender what he can tell me about what's happening. He snorts like he can't believe how dumb cops are. "You not seeing the same thing I'm seeing?" "Did you see how it started?" "Hell should I know. Guy's been here since 2 this afternoon, crying in his booze. All at once he jumps up and starts taking the place apart." I look back toward what's left of the tip-top, which wasn't much to begin with. It sounds like a demolition crew working late in there. "Did you hear him say what he was upset about?" "Lost his job, girl kicked him out, whatever." The bartender dabs an imaginary tear. "Spare me. We all got problems." "Do you know if there's anyone injured?" "Guy looks like he goes about $1.50, the bartender says, ignoring me completely. Know what he was doing right before he went ballistic?" "No," I say. "What was he doing?" "Just sitting at the bar, fiddling with his fingers, right?" The bartender goes too quickly into his back pocket, comes out with something in his hand. All I see is a flash of metal. Reflexively, I take 2 steps back, draw my service weapon, and tell him to drop whatever he's holding. "Jesus!" He throws up his hands, tossing the object to the pavement between us. "What the hell, man?" The object lands with a clatter and skids toward the toe of my boot. It turns out to be a simple barkeeper's combination tool, a bottle opener, a small dull blade for cutting foil, a corkscrew. I stoop down and pick it up, and that's when I see what the guy was trying to show me. The corkscrew has been straightened. I holster my weapon. The bartender sees me contemplating the unraveled corkscrew. He puts his hands down and says, "His fingers, yo." There's a horrendous crash. The bartender and I both duck our heads as a jagged new hole bursts open in the roof of the tip-top lounge. While we stand there, a 12-foot column of wood and marble soars up and out of the building like a missile from a silo, trailing shingles and insulation. I've seen any number of wonderments, but I can't say I've ever seen a bar counter fly before. From the curb, we watch the slab reach the peak of its trajectory, momentarily illuminated in the bird unit's spotlight, casting a shadow over the parking lot below. The shadow spreads. Patrons scatter. The bar lands where a number of them had been standing, breaking apart in a riot of splintering oak and crumbling stone. "Aw, now." The bartender seems genuinely pained to observe that he has no bar left to tend. "That ain't right." Before I can key my radio, our subject emerges. He stalks out the front of the tip-top through the smoke and dust. The bartender is right. He doesn't look like much at first glance. Narrow-chested, disheveled, wild-eyed, panting. He looks very much like what I'm told he is, a drunk on a bender. Still, when he sees that a new set of cops has arrived, the bartender mutters, "Uh-oh," and runs for cover. I turn momentarily, my attention drawn by the bartender suddenly running in the other direction. I feel a tingle at the back of my neck. The next thing I feel is a floating sensation. I have time enough to realize that I'm sailing low through the air before a bone-shuddering impact takes my breath. I land in a puddle of pain at the base of a wall 20 feet away. My head is ringing. I may have blacked out, but I'm not sure. I think I'm in one piece, but I'm not sure about that either. Everything hurts. I pull myself together. The first thing I see is our subject, standing in the middle of the street, washed in blinding white light from the police chopper hovering overhead. He's picked up my cruiser and raised it over his head with both hands. The chopper's spotlight creates the picture of a circus strongman standing center ring. I imagine the scene from inside the chopper and think of an ant hoisting a chunk of bread. I can see Vasquez inside the car, pounding on the window. I scramble to my feet, drag a breath into my lungs, and shout a warning. The subject isn't listening. "Sir!" He crouches, flexes. There's no time to negotiate. Sealed inside the cruiser, 6 feet off the ground, Vasquez is scrambling for the door handle, but she's not going to make it out. I see the guy's back twitching beneath his grime-stained shirt as he pivots and rears on his heels. All at once, the bird is a hovering bullseye. There's no time to think about it. I point my finger and let it happen. Somewhere deep in my head, I feel the familiar pulse, a depth charge somewhere on the floor of my brain. Just before I lose consciousness, I see the subject go limp as his strength disappears. Then the subject disappears, crushed beneath the weight of the cruiser. The car bounces and rocks on impact. I hear crumpling steel, the pop and hiss of rupturing tires. I see the windows shatter and rain out of the unit, nuggets of safety glass twinkling in the street. I wake up to flashing lights, radio chatter, shouting, running, a circle of cops standing over me. I don't recognize any of them. They're looking at me the same way the bartender looked at his corkscrew. One of them says, "How the crap did you do that?" I don't know what to tell him. In his day, my father could wad up a car bumper in his fist. I had an uncle on my mom's side who accidentally killed himself by jumping too high. My whole family comes from gifted stock. Mother and father's side both. The year I turned drinking age, I watched my cousin Shirley win a bar bet by turning it 30 paces and lighting a man's cigar using only her eyes. Me? If the subject can't be avoided, this is what I tell people. When I was 4 weeks old, I accidentally disabled my Uncle Neil. It happened on a Sunday in the house where I grew up. According to the story I've been told, Uncle Neil had been holding me in his arms, bouncing me around and making funny faces, when suddenly I flushed red and let out a wail. Uncle Neil's gift had been his hearing. He'd worked in counterintelligence for the Federation during the Chem Wars. Later, in the private sector, he'd grown fat on government contracts as an engineering consultant. They say Uncle Neil could sound out structural imperfections in a 10-kiloton suspension bridge by tapping on a girder with a ballpoint pen. It was my crying that deafened him. More accurately, my distress. Apparently, on that day, for whatever reason, I'd felt threatened for the first time in my tiny infant life, and for the first time that day, my gift revealed itself. Uncle Neil never regained his. The lab coats all say I'm a miracle. They don't know how I work or why. All they know is they've never seen another like me. My fellow officers like me because I'm good with a gifted collar, but none of them are sure about me otherwise. They all wonder on some level if they'll get sterile or have a stroke or forget how to tie their shoelaces if they stand too close. I've tried to explain that my gift, if that's what it is, affects only my own kind. Gifts of strength I can enfeeble. Born supersonic, I can make you lame. If your gift is sight, hey, I can blind your ass. But if you're a natural, I'm just some guy. My own kind thinks I'm a freak. Most who know me avoid me like the plague. I've tried to explain that I learned to control my gift, if that's what it is, around the same time I learned to walk. Nobody really believes me. For a week, the tip-top is all over the news. The man I neutralized was named Leroy Penny. Divorced, 6 kids, lived with his girlfriend in a ramshackle one-bedroom cracker box on the east side of town. He'd worked 20 years for the Federation Armory on Deer Island, right up until the morning of his rampage, when he'd been terminated without severance for drinking on the job. Naturally, there were half a dozen implant cams among the witnesses from the bar. Naturally, every one of them took the opportunity to sell their footage to the networks. Of course, the witnesses were all hopelessly drunk when it happened, so their clips are murky and out of focus. 2 days ago, the department released official photos and footage from the bird unit's onboard cameras, and that's what the papers and the news stations are running now. Techs in the department have edited my service weapon off of my hip and into my hand. The ID tags on the doors and roof of my cruiser have been replaced with a Southeast District car number. In these approved images, according to standard department procedure, my face is a blob of pixels. Same for Tina Vasquez. Hero cop saves partner, colleagues, bystanding citizens. The chief, the deputy ops, and the public information office covered my identity at the press conference. The truth has been modulated for public consumption. Natural officer, gifted perp, lethal force regrettable but required. Race relations are a sensitive area. The last riot that started in the gifted community destroyed 100 square city blocks before the Federation stepped in. Nobody wants a repeat. Meanwhile, I'm suspended with pay until the Internal Review Board convenes. Well, look who it is. Uncle Phil brightens when he sees me. Mr. Big Deal. Uncle Philly. I give him a hug. How's the hip? He snorts. The hip apparently isn't worth talking about. Instead, he looks both ways, up and down the hall. He waits for a nurse to push an empty wheelchair past us. Then he leans in and says, "Didn't I see you on the news?" Here we go. Don't know what you mean, Uncle Phil. Horse hockey. You mean that mess down by the yards? Uncle Phil rolls his eyes. Come on, I tell him. I work the 3rd Northwest, you know that. Right, he nods slowly. I forgot. I wasn't even on duty Monday night. Sure, more nodding. Sure. I'm serious. Whatever you say, kid. He pats my cheek and changes the subject. So, what's the occasion? Haven't seen you here in a while. Here is a private ward on the 7th floor at Hope Mercy, outside my father's room, where he's been refusing to die for going on 12 years now. There's no occasion. I only came to visit Tina Vasquez down on 3. She broke her pelvis and both ankles when our cruiser crash-landed on top of Leroy Penny with her still trapped inside. But Vasquez was sleeping when I got here, and I didn't want to disturb her. I had an hour to kill. I look around. Uncle Phil is right. It's been a while. I guess I've been busy, I tell him. He winks. I'll say. Enough already. Oh, fine. Uncle Phil waves his hand. Go see your dad. I need to pee. I look in through the observation window into my father's room. A bed, machines, pumps and tubes, bags of fluid. My father. Once upon a time, his gifts were multiple and mighty. A package, in Federation parlance. Strength, agility, sensory perception, cognition. He had them all. But they were merely accessories. The lab coats referred to my father's main gift as supernormal trauma resistance. In plain language, Dad was built like a brick house. Flesh like Kevlar, bones like iron. By constitution, he was damn near indestructible. On top of that, something in his makeup allowed his body to heal at an accelerated pace. They say that in his prime, you could pick your caliber, shoot my father point blank in the chest, and the scar tissue would form so quickly that you'd find the flattened slug on the ground at his feet. He served 16 tours in the Chem Wars, my father, one of the most decorated combat officers the Federation ever produced. In peacetime, the public came to know him, through the media, as the hard bargain. Violent criminals came to know him as mandatory retirement. Ironically, it was my father's impervious foundation that ultimately retired him. For 4 decades, in the service of the common good, he absorbed gunshots, stabbings, conflagrations, falls from great heights, and the kind of damage that would spread a natural citizen over a country mile like so much fertilizer. And then, finally, little by little, my father's jungle of internal scar tissue began to strangle his own organs, shutting him down one function at a time. Imagine a village, his main doctor once told me. In the center of the village, there's a crazed rhinoceros, a great, magnificent bull. The warriors have thrown net after net over the animal, and they finally staked him to the ground. He's bound fast, this rhino. There's no escape for him. But he just won't stop struggling. Do you see? I hadn't. The doctor nodded, uncapped his pen, and circled a cloudy area on my father's chest scan. Your dad's heart is that rhino, he said. It was big news when the hard bargain slipped into his coma. For a year, you couldn't go anywhere without hearing about it. Eventually, the world moved on. Now I'm standing here on the 7th floor of Hope Mercy with my Uncle Phil, looking at a shriveled pile of sinew in a bed on the other side of the glass. Somewhere in there is a heart that doesn't know enough to quit beating. I'm not sure why I even came up here, to be honest. My father hasn't been conscious in a decade, and it only makes his monitor alarms go off when I step into his room. My uncle looks at me gently. Then buy me some coffee already, he says. We walk down to the cafeteria together. Uncle Phil is using both his canes, and there's a hitch in his gait. His hip has been shot for years, but for some reason he won't have it replaced. For the first time, I notice how much smaller Uncle Phil looks these days. I suppose he's getting up there. You know, he'd be proud of you, he tells me, after we find a table and I hand him his coffee. I can't help chuckling at that. Don't laugh, Uncle Phil says. I know my brother. Dad thought the police were a waste of space, I remind him. Rule-happy pansies, I think he used to say. Uncle Phil shrugs. Age seasons a person. Uncle Phil used to make his own weather. They say family picnics were always sunny in his day. A virus attacked his central nervous system several years before I was born, and I suppose that's why he was always the one person in my family, besides my mother, who didn't clear the room whenever I came in. Unlike my father, Uncle Phil's gift was long gone before I showed up. I sense him watching me. What? I say. Uncle Phil opens his mouth and pauses. Finally, he says, He always loved you. You do know that, right? I sip my coffee. He didn't know how sometimes, Uncle Phil says. I'll give you that. But he always loved you. I imagine what it must have been like for my father, to be frightened of his own weakling son, to be appalled by his only offspring. It couldn't have been easy. I can't say that I've ever really blamed him. You know, I tell Uncle Phil, I'm not sure that he and I ever talked again after Mom died. I can't remember time anyway. Well, Uncle Phil says, he was never the same after your mother passed. I'll give you that. I guess that's one thing we have in common anyway. Before she had me, my mother's gift had been flight. She always told me the trade was worth it. You're more alike than you think, Uncle Phil says, you and my brother. Whatever you say, Uncle Phil. We sip our coffee and don't say anything for a while. Eventually, Uncle Phil pipes up. So, he says, you dropped a police car on a guy? I wonder, did I do Leroy Penny a favor? I try to imagine his life, but of course I can't. I don't know if his gift was a blessing or a curse. Sure, he had problems, but I think of what the bartender said. We all got problems. I don't know if Leroy Penny was a good father, a good neighbor, a good friend. I don't know if his children miss him or if they're glad he's gone. I'm lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking of my own father. I wonder, could I help him? The doctors can't. There's not a scalpel that could open him, no medicine that can turn back the clock. He spent a lifetime trying to save the world, my father, the hard bargain. But he couldn't help me. He couldn't help the Leroy Pennies. Now he can't even help himself. Could I show him, in a way that I never could before, that in spite of the gulf that's always existed between us, I love him too? If I placed my hand on my father's chest, could I make his stubborn heart be still? This is what I'm wondering when the front door of my apartment bursts open on its hinges. My own heart leaps. I bolt upright in bed. I have only enough time to wonder what the hell is going on before my training kicks in. In a flash, I assess what I know. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm in my underwear. My service weapon is in the top drawer of my nightstand. I put it in my hand and move. I don't get far. When I wake up on the floor of my bedroom, my hand is empty. There's a light in my face. A voice says, I'm going to enjoy this. I feel like I've been hit in the back of the head with a lead pipe. The light hurts my eyes. I'm a cop, I say. Think it through. I hear a chuckle. I know who you are. The light goes away. Spots dance in my vision. As I struggle to a sitting position, I hear a whistling sound and a bomb goes off in my knee. Astonishing pain. Oh yeah, the voice says. Gonna enjoy this plenty. It's all I can do to say, who are you? There's a click. A flashlight. My assailant shows me his face. Mean eyes, black stubble, a smile. He's missing teeth, part of one ear. His hair is lank, thinning. I see that it is, in fact, a length of pipe he's holding in his hand. Name's Dwayne Penny, he says. Believe you met my brother. Something cold and heavy sinks to the bottom of my gut. Only I ain't gifted like he was. Dwayne Penny licks his lips. There's another click, and his flashlight goes dark again. He answers the obvious question before I can ask. There's this cop I know, see? Plays on my pool league. Well, listen, seems like them Southeast boys ain't so happy about looking like a bunch of jerks on the TV. How about that, huh? Superman, you feeling gifted now? I don't know what to tell him. Tina Vasquez comes to visit me at Hope Mercy every couple days. She's been back on the job for a few weeks. Feels good as new, she says. When I ask her what it's like out there, she always grins and says, same crap, different day, right? Then she'll shrug her shoulders. Hey, somebody's got to scoop it. She always pats my leg through the covers when she leaves, and so far, I still can't feel it. But it's nice anyway. Uncle Phil makes his rounds. Every day's a gift, he tells me. Sometimes late at night when the floor is quiet, I imagine I can hear my father's heart beating up on 7, reliable as clockwork, stubborn as a bull rhino, showing me how it's done. On we go. That is my attempt at creating a new superhero. The assignment for the superhero anthology was everybody had to come up with a new superhero with new powers. And I was having a trouble thinking of a superhero that had powers that no one had ever seen before. So I decided to make a superhero whose only power was he could make your powers go away. So that's how Mr. Big Deal came into existence with the help of John McNally. How are we on time? Let's see. I'm going to read a section from my new novel, which is scheduled to be published in February. It's a thriller. It takes place in a fictional university town that I created called Clark Falls, Iowa, which I imagine to be somewhere between Council Bluffs and Sioux City, up in the bluffs there along the river. I wanted to continue writing stories set in this part of the country, and I was having trouble deciding, where to put this one. And I decided that the best thing to do when in doubt was to just make up the whole town, and that way I could have everything I needed, and I could put everything where I needed it to be, and I didn't have to worry about anybody wondering, where the streets were or which way the trees grew or anything like that. So I created a town, and I won't tell you much about the story. I'll just read, depending on how the time goes, and I'll glance up occasionally and see how many eyes are glazing over. I'll read as much of the first 2 chapters of my new novel as you guys can stand, and that should be a better synopsis or setup for the book than I can give you verbally. So the book is called Safer. It is written by me, and here we go. The opening of the book starts with a couple of quotes. The Bible tells us to love our neighbors and also to love our enemies, probably because generally they are the same people. Gilbert K. Chesterton. It is evidently consoling to reflect that the people next door are headed for hell. Aleister Crowley. Friday, December 16, 9:25 p.m. My wife, Sarah, and I are hosting a faculty party at our home when the Clark Falls Police Department arrives to take me into custody. It's the last day of the fall semester. On campus, offices are darkened, final exams completed, lecture halls standing empty until the new year. Most of our colleagues, a few graduate students, and assorted companions have retreated here, at our invitation, to shake off the cold and brace for the holidays. The house smells like mulled cider and catered food. Hickory logs crackle in the fireplace while conversation bubbles and alcohol flows. I'm at the foot of the staircase with Warren Geiler, the Chancellor's husband, where we found common ground on Islay Scotch, the '04 Red Sox, and a mutual ambivalence regarding faculty parties. Winter air threads its way into the festivities. "I'm sorry," I hear my wife say. She's standing at the front door in her dress and heels, talking to a man in an overcoat. I see 2 uniformed officers behind him, breathing clouds on our stoop. "Can you tell me what this is about?" "Uh-oh," Geiler says to me. "Those men look stern." He's right, they do. "I'd better go help," I tell him. "You're not wanted, are you?" "Not to my knowledge. Possibly the music is too loud." I chuckle and excuse myself. Sarah gives me a worried look as I join her at the door. She looks terrific with her hair up. "Evening, guys." I smile. "Cold tonight." "Paul Calloway?" "That's right." There are 2 squad cars parked in front of our house, plus an unmarked sedan in our driveway, behind the catering van. Is something wrong? The man in the overcoat reproduces the badge he's just shown Sarah, a gold shield seated in a black leather wallet. He stands medium height, trim and efficient looking, gray hair neatly combed. Detective Bell, according to the ID card. "Mr. Calloway, we're here to place you under arrest." "Excuse me?" Bell hands me a folded document. "I'll give you a minute to find a coat." Sarah takes the papers out of my hand. "Let me see that." "Guys," I say, "obviously there's a mistake." "I'll give you a minute," Bell repeats, "to find a coat." Our guests are starting to pay closer attention now. The simmering stew of conversation thins near the door. Sarah, leafing through what appears to be a court-issued arrest warrant, takes a short breath and whispers, "Paul, I'm telling you, I don't even have any parking tickets. Arrest me for what?" "Suspicion of the sexual exploitation of a minor," Bell informs me, this time louder than strictly necessary. He produces a second document. "This entitles us to search the premises, as well as your office on campus." My office on campus? I don't even have an office on campus. I have a mailbox and a table I like in the faculty lounge. In the pin-drop background, all conversation has ceased. I hear the silence rippling through the house, but I've had 3 rounds of scotch with Warren Geiler, and now I've lost my temper. Let me see that badge again. "I can instruct the officers to handcuff you and Mirandize you right here on the steps if that's the way you'd prefer to accomplish this." Bell looks me in the eyes. "But I can see that you're having a party." "Some detective." Sarah says, "Paul, in spite of the shock, I know exactly who's behind this little production, but it still doesn't make any sense." "Sexual what?" I picture all of this from the point of view of one of our guests. Say, for instance, Warren Geiler, the Chancellor's husband. And I realize that by reacting the way any reasonable person might, I'm only making things worse. In fact, I can see in the tense, ready look on the faces of the 2 officers flanking Detective Bell that I'm possibly one good outburst away from getting tasered in my own doorway. "This has to be a joke," I say. "Mr. Calloway, you have the right to remain silent." Detective Bell stands aside as one of the officers moves his hands to the cuffs on his belt. Jesus. I kiss Sarah on the forehead, break away, and reach for the closet. "Paul, this says—" "It's okay. I nod inside the house. See if anybody in there knows a lawyer who can make things as unpleasant as possible for Detective Bell and his teenage sons here." "I want your badge numbers before you leave," Sarah says. "All of you." She's taken her administrative tone, and something about the sound of it fills my heart with gratitude. It tells me, if I needed to know, that despite all we've been through these past few months, we're still playing on the same team. For the moment, that's all I need to set aside the fundamental injustice underway here, swallow the 100 protests clanging in my head, and move this insanity away from our doorstep. I put on my coat and join the 2 officers waiting to escort me to the curb. The night air is a bracing slap that leaves me hyper-alert yet strangely numb at the same time. On either side of me, I can feel the officers' hands on my elbows. I can feel the flagstones beneath the soles of my shoes. I can hear myself breathing, feel the hairs freezing in my nostrils, but none of it seems real. At the curb, the cop on my left cuffs my hands in front of me and puts me in the back of the lead squad unit, behind the wire cage. The other cop finishes informing me, in case I didn't catch it the first time, of my right to remain silent. As to rights, I have a number of others, and he lets me know about those. Do I understand? No. I nod my head anyway. The door slams shut, muffling the world outside. The officer who handcuffed me retraces his step back to our front door, where he says something to Detective Bell, then something to Sarah, giving his badge number as requested, I presume. The silence around me is punctuated by the occasional soft crackle of the police radio up front. The car smells like peppermint and sweat. After a few moments, the officer returns and gets in behind the wheel. I know you're just doing your job, I tell him through the wire cage, but this is outrageous. He makes a sound like it isn't a shift until somebody tells him that very thing. How old is this kid? Except for the uniform and the gun that goes with it, he looks like he could be a new freshman on campus. Out of curiosity, who am I supposed to have exploited? I'd really love to know. The officer speaks a few words into his radio in a code-riddled language I don't understand, then fastens his seatbelt and starts the car. Our house is the first on the left as you enter the circle, making it the last house you pass as you leave. All of our guests' cars are facing my direction. But these cops came in backwards, straight to our address, which means that we drive clockwise all the way around the circle in order to exit, past each of our neighbors, one by one. Through the foggy backseat window, I see Pete and Melody Seward's porch light go dark as we roll past. I guess these cars don't go in reverse, I say, still too angry to be humiliated. We pass Trish and Barry Firth's house, now Michael and Ben's. I saw Michael not half an hour ago in our kitchen tutoring the caterers. Back up into the driveway, turn around. Oh, wait, but then you couldn't parade me around the neighborhood first. You're right, this is much better. Let's have a contest, the young cop finally says. Whoever can be quietest all the way to the station wins. How about that? Gee, I don't know, officer. Condescending jerk. Who gets to judge? Sycamore Court is decked for the holidays. All around the circle, white light drips like icicles from the dormers and eaves. Tendrils of smoke curl from the chimneys, and all the trees twinkle in the cold. I see a wet glint in the dark as the cop's eyes flicker to the mirror again. That's a good point, he says. I guess it'll have to be your word against mine, sir. We're almost all the way around now. Between the squat stone pillars on either side of the entrance, I can see a black ribbon of newly topped asphalt that will take us around the tree line, down the hill, and into the thick of Ponca Heights, the newer development below. I take a long look at my neighbor Roger's house as we roll past, directly across the circle from ours. His dark windows seem to be watching us. I sense the meaning in the cop's eyes, still fixed on me in the mirror. Get the picture? For the first time, I feel a chill in my joints that has nothing to do with the weather. I get the picture. Off we go. Chapter 2. I'll read a bit of Chapter 2 and then... Our neighbors say they can't believe how much Clark Falls has grown. They wonder where all the people are coming from. Sarah and I came from Boston, and to us, Clark Falls feels more or less like what it is, a pleasant little university town 1,500 miles from Boston. The city proper tucks up against a range of forested bluffs which rise unexpectedly from the Iowa flatlands and run along the eastern bank of the Missouri River. We've learned that these bluffs are known as the Luss Hills, which explains the town slogan found on welcome signs posted at the city limits. Clark Falls, less is more. 45,000 people live here, 60,000 during the school term. According to the plaque on the front steps of the courthouse, the original township, built up around the frontier fur trade, earned its name for the modest tumble of spring water William Clark pointed out to Meriwether Lewis some months into their storied walk to the Pacific Ocean 200 years ago. We don't go up the front steps of the courthouse. Instead, I'm driven around back to a secured parking facility, then escorted into the adjoining building which houses the Clark Falls Municipal Jail. I realize that I've been anticipating the police station. I know what the inside of the police station looks like because Sarah and I went there together back in July to leaf through mugshots. I've been thinking of the police station, not the jail, and that's the first thing that makes all of this start to sink in. The officer who drove me here, C. Mishnick, according to the nameplate pinned to his fur-collared duty coat, stops in a frosty vestibule and checks his gun at a bank of small gray lockers. He takes the locker key in one hand, my elbow in the other, and pushes on through the next set of doors. I'm led down a buzzing fluorescent corridor, past two officers on their way out, and into a grimy central pod for booking. A middle-aged desk sergeant with veins in his cheeks sits me down in a cold plastic chair. He asks me questions without looking at me, hunts and pecks at a plastic-covered keyboard. I'm entering the system. When does somebody explain this? I shift in my chair. Where's Detective Bell? Address of residency, the sergeant says. I can only imagine what the sergeant must be thinking. When does somebody explain this? Wouldn't an innocent man have asked for an explanation already? Or maybe the sergeant couldn't care less. Maybe he's just waiting for my information so that he can type it into the blank spots on his computer screen. Why didn't I take the time to read the arrest warrant? There I was, marching out of the house with a righteous stride, and now I don't know the first thing about the charges against me. I feel like I've leapt off the end of a sturdy dock onto a frozen pond, and the ice is cracking all around me. The sergeant is waiting. I'd like to make a phone call, I say. Address. I take a deep breath and let it out slowly. Now the sergeant finally looks at me. He raises his eyebrows. 34 Sycamore Court, I tell him, starting the gears of the justice machine turning again. I know that Clark Falls isn't Boston. It can't be more than 15 degrees outside. The local bars won't close for 3 more hours, and I have no frame of reference in the first place, but still, it must be slow in here for a Friday. Except for me and the desk sergeant, the intake area is bright and vacant. A plate of crumbs and candy sprinkles sits in a puddle of red cellophane on a nearby table. There's a spindly artificial Christmas tree standing cockeyed in the corner. Colored lights blink a few times, chase each other around the frazzled branches, then blink again. I follow the faint crackle of radio chatter to a glass partition labeled Dispatch, where a young woman wearing a bulky holiday sweater and a radio headset sits behind a shoulder-high console working the controls. I hear Officer Mishnick joking around with somebody down the hall. In a moment, I see him emerge with a foam cup in one hand, steam curling around the rim. He pauses to chat up the dispatcher through the glass. Sitting there, hands cuffed in my lap, robotically answering these questions about the mundane nuts and bolts of my life, it strikes me that, on the right side of things, this is just a place where people work. They come here for a while and go home again. In between, they joke and eat cookies and earn paychecks. There's no way to get comfortable in this chair. The desk sergeant pokes at the keys and squints at his screen. Hard steel gnaws at my wrist bones. I forgot to put on gloves before I stalked out of the house, and my hands are freezing. I'm on the wrong side of things. This is happening. The officer who catalogs my personal belongings has a gunmetal crew cut and a faded gray Marine Corps tattoo on one leathery forearm. He tells me I shouldn't get too comfortable. I might not be staying. Apparently they've been having problems with heat in parts of the facility. It's an old building, 12 beds and a drunk tank, used primarily to hold people who are waiting to bond out, sober up, or appear before a judge. If the housing area goes on the blink, I'll be transported to the county facility on the north edge of town. I tell him that I doubt I'll get comfortable. If he hears me speaking, I wouldn't know. They say that time crawls behind bars, but I wouldn't know that either. My jail cell doesn't have bars. It has a steel door with a small square window, shatterproof glass threaded with wire. There's an oblong slot in the door at about waist level. Bolted beneath the slot is a gray metal tray. Bolted to the wall is an iron cot with a thin vinyl pad that smells like disinfectant. Bolted to the floor is a small steel toilet with half an inch of blue fluid in the bowl. Time could be speeding right along for all I know because the old cop with the Marine Corps tattoo took my watch, along with my wallet and cell phone. my photo, my fingerprints. It doesn't matter. Lying on my hard cot in my quiet cell with my arm draped over my eyes, smelling the stuff they gave me to wipe the ink from my fingers, I can't muster the will to care what time it is. At my request, I've been shown a copy of my arrest warrant, along with the sworn affidavit detailing the charges against me. The charges include 2 counts of producing pornographic images of a child. According to the arrest affidavit, this constitutes a Class C felony, punishable by not more than 10 years imprisonment. I am charged with 1 count of promoting the pornographic images of a child, a Class D felony, punishable by not more than 5 years imprisonment. I am subject to a grand total of not more than $200,000 in fines. By now, my computer has been confiscated from my office at home. My credit card, bank, telephone, and internet account records have been subpoenaed. I expect the party at our house is probably over. The child named in the affidavit is Brittany Seward, my next-door neighbor's 13-year-old daughter, our friend Pete's daughter, our friend Melody's stepdaughter. I wanted to know. I'll stop there.